Even though he was late to care for his cancer-stricken father, he wouldn't leave the disoriented elderly woman in the rain. The next morning, when a luxury car pulled up at his door, his mother burst into tears learning that rain pelted the cracked Chicago sidewalks as Jamal Thompson darted between hurrying pedestrians, his worn backpack bouncing against his shoulder blades. The 13-year-old's sneakers, already falling apart at the seams, splashed through puddles that reflected the gray afternoon sky. His school uniform, a blue polo shirt and khaki pants from the discount store, clung to his thin frame. "Excuse me," he muttered, dodging a businessman who barely glanced at him. The digital clock on the bank building showed 3:45 p.m. He was already 15 minutes late. Jamal's phone buzzed in his pocket. Another text from his mom. "Don't forget your father's medicine. Love you." The Walgreens sign glowed ahead through the rain. Jamal pushed through the glass doors, the blast of air conditioning hitting his damp skin. He headed straight for the pharmacy section, but the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He didn't need to turn around to know he was being followed. The security guard's footsteps echoed behind him, just far enough to maintain plausible deniability. Jamal had heard those footsteps too many times not to recognize them. "Can I help you find something?" The guard's voice carried that familiar edge of suspicion. "No, sir," Jamal replied without turning around. "Just picking up my dad's prescription." He approached the pharmacy counter where Mrs. Chun, the regular pharmacist, gave him a warm smile. She was one of the few who treated him like any other customer. "Hello, Jamal. Here for Mr. Thompson's medication?" "Yes, ma'am." He pulled out the crumpled insurance card and the last $20 bill from his pocket. The guard still hovered nearby, pretending to organize a display of bandages. Mrs. Chun typed on her computer. Her smile faltered. "I'm sorry, Jamal. The insurance. There seems to be an issue with the coverage." Jamal's stomach dropped. "What kind of issue?" "The copay is higher this month. It's going to be $48. The 20 in his hand suddenly felt very small. His mother's voice from that morning echoed in his head. "Baby, we're cutting it real close this month. The hospital bills." She'd been sitting at their small kitchen table, calculator in hand, circles under her eyes. "I might need to pick up some extra shifts at the diner." "How many extra shifts?" Jamal had asked, knowing what that meant. More time alone with his dad, trying to help him to the bathroom, making sure he took his meds on time. "Just a few. Mr. Davis says he can use me on weekends too." She'd forced a smile. "We'll make it work. We always do." Now at the pharmacy counter, Jamal swallowed hard. Can I pay 20 now and bring the rest tomorrow?" Mrs. Chun glanced at her computer screen, then at the security guard who was still pretending not to watch them. She lowered her voice. "I'm not supposed to do this, but yes. Just make sure you bring the remainder tomorrow." "Thank you, Mrs. Chun. I promise I will." She handed him the white paper bag with his father's pills. As Jamal turned to leave, the guard finally stepped away, but his eyes followed until Jamal was out the door. Back in the rain, Jamal clutched the medication to his chest. His grandfather's voice drifted through his memory. One of their last conversations before the cancer took him to, just 3 months ago. "You're the man of the house now alongside your daddy. And being a man means doing what needs doing, no matter how hard it gets." "But what if I'm not strong enough, Grandpa?" "Strength ain't about muscles, boy. It's about getting up every morning and putting one foot in front of the other, even when your shoes are full of rocks." A car horn blared, jolting Jamal back to the present. He hurried across the street, passing a high-end clothing store where a well-dressed woman clutched her purse tighter as he walked by. The familiar sting barely registered anymore. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from his father. "Where are you, son?" Jamal picked up his pace, the pharmacy bag tucked safely under his jacket. 2 more blocks to go. The rain was coming down harder now, darkness gathering early under the heavy clouds. He passed the usual landmarks, the broken bus stop bench, the mural of Martin Luther King Jr. With its peeling paint, the corner store where Mr. Washington sometimes gave him day-old bread for free. His dad would be sitting in his recliner by now, probably trying to hide how much pain he was in. The doctors had said the latest round of chemo might be rougher than the previous ones. Jamal had pretended not to hear his mother crying in the bathroom after that appointment. Another text lit up his phone, called the pharmacy. "Thank Mrs. Chin for me. Love, Mom." Jamal wiped rain from his face. Or maybe they were tears. it was hard to tell the difference anymore. The weight of the medication in his hands felt heavier than it should, like it carried all their hopes and fears and unpaid bills. He was about to turn the final corner toward home when something caught his eye. Through the curtain of rain, a figure huddled against the wall of the Michigan Avenue Bank building. An elderly woman in a soaked gray coat, holding a piece of cardboard with running ink. She looked lost, confused, her white hair plastered to her forehead. Jamal checked his phone again. 4:15 p.m. His dad needed his medication. His mom was counting on him. He took a step forward, then stopped. The woman's hands were shaking as she tried to keep hold of her sign. Her eyes darted around without seeming to see anything. Another gust of wind sent rain sideways, and she hunched further into herself. "Keep walking," Jamal whispered to himself. "Just keep walking." But his grandfather's voice came back again. "The measure of a man ain't in what he does when it's easy. It's in what he does when it's hard." Jamal stood frozen in the rain, the pharmacy bag clutched to his chest, as his phone buzzed once more in his pocket. He looked at the elderly woman, then in the direction of home, then back at the woman. The choice he made in that moment would change everything. Jamal's feet felt like lead as he took his first step toward the elderly woman. The pharmacy bag crinkled against his chest, a reminder of his responsibilities at home. He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to see her blue-veined hands trembling against the wet cardboard. "Ma'am?" His voice came out quieter than he intended. "Ma'am, are you okay?" She didn't look up. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear over the rain and traffic. The sign in her hands was barely legible now, the ink running in dark streams. Jamal's phone vibrated again. His father's name lit up the screen, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. Not yet. He moved closer, holding his already soaked backpack over his head to shield them both from the rain. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" This time she looked up. Her eyes were a startling pale blue, clouded with confusion. Deep lines etched her face, but there was something elegant about her features, like a faded photograph of someone important. I need to get home," she said, her voice cultured despite its tremor. "But I can't remember where it is. Do you know where my house is?" Jamal's chest tightened. She reminded him of his grandfather in those final weeks, when the pain medication would sometimes make him confused. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Eleanor." She blinked rapidly, rainwater dripping from her eyelashes. "Eleanor, I think." "Yes, Eleanor." Her gaze drifted past him to the busy street. "My son knows. He always knows everything." "Where's your son now?" "Boston." This came out clear and certain. "He's very important there. He has a big office with windows that look at the ocean." Then the clarity faded, her face crumpling in confusion. "But that was that yesterday?" Jamal's phone buzzed again. A text from his mother. "Dad's asking for you. Everything okay?" His fingers hovered over the keyboard. What could he say? "Sorry, Mom. I'm standing in the rain with a lost elderly woman instead of bringing Dad his medicine." His grandfather's words echoed again. "The measure of a man." "Ma'am, Eleanor," he corrected himself, remembering how his grandfather had hated being called Serb in his final days. "Let me help you find someone who can get you home." She clutched her cardboard sign tighter. "Home?" "Yes." It had blue shutters. Or were they green? Thomas would know. Thomas always knows. "Is Thomas your son?" "Yes, no, he's—" Her voice trailed off as she stared at something only she could see. Jamal pulled out his phone again, this time to search for local shelters or social services. The screen showed 3 missed calls from home. His wet fingers slipped on the glass as he tried to type. A group of teenagers passed by, one of them calling out, "Hey, kid, better watch your wallet around that one." They laughed, the sound sharp against the rain. Eleanor flinched at their voices, pressing herself harder against the wall. Jamal stepped closer, instinctively placing himself between her and the street. The teens moved on, but their laughter lingered. "Don't worry about them," he said, though his own heart was racing. "They're just being stupid." His phone buzzed yet again. This time it was a voicemail from his mother. "Baby, please call me back. Dad's pain is getting worse, and he needs his medication." "Where are you?" Jamal's throat felt tight. He should go. He needed to go. His father was in pain, waiting for him. But when he looked at Eleanor, huddled and shivering against the wall. All he could see was his grandfather in that hospital bed, saying, "Sometimes God puts people in our path for a reason, boy." "Eleanor," he said, making his voice firm like his mother did when he was scared. "I'm going to call someone who can help us?" "Okay. Someone who can find your son in Boston." She looked at him with those pale blue eyes, suddenly sharp with fear. "Don't leave me here. Please. Everyone keeps walking past, but you stopped. You stopped. I'm not leaving," he promised, even as his phone buzzed again in his hand. "I'm going to stay right here with you." He dialed 311, the city services number, while keeping his eyes on Eleanor. She had started mumbling again, something about blue shutters and a garden with roses. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "City services, how may I direct your call?" "I need help," Jamal said, his voice cracking. "I'm on Michigan Avenue, near the bank building. There's an elderly woman here. She's confused and can't remember where she lives. I think she might have Alzheimer's or something. She says her son is in Boston, but she can't remember much else. Is she in immediate danger?" Jamal looked at the darkening sky, the rush hour traffic splashing through puddles, the people hurrying past with averted eyes. "I don't know, but she can't stay out here. It's raining, and it's getting dark, and—" "Stay on the line," the operator said. "I'm connecting you with social services." While he waited, Jamal's phone beeped with a low battery warning. 15% left. Another text from his mother appeared, called Mrs. Chin again. "She said you left the pharmacy an hour ago. Please answer me, Jamal. I'm worried." Eleanor had started shivering more violently now. Without thinking, Jamal shrugged off his school blazer and draped it over her shoulders. It was already wet, but it was better than nothing. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling it close. "You're a good boy. Like my Thomas. He was a good boy too before he got too busy for visits." The operator's voice came back on the line. "Sir, I'm connecting you now. Please stay with her until help arrives." Jamal looked at his phone's battery indicator, now at 12%, then at the pharmacy bag under his arm, then at Eleanor's trembling hands clutching his blazer. "I'll stay," he said to both the operator and Eleanor. "I'm not going anywhere." In that moment, standing in the rain with a borrowed blazer and a dying phone, Jamal understood what his grandfather had meant about strength. It wasn't about having all the answers or even knowing if you were doing the right thing. Sometimes it was just about being there when everyone else walked past. His phone buzzed one final time. The screen lit up with his father's face, smiling from better days. Jamal closed his eyes, said a silent prayer for forgiveness, and let it ring. The rain turned from a steady drizzle to a heavy downpour. Water streamed down Michigan Avenue in dark rivers, carrying cigarette butts and crumpled paper past their feet. Jamal's phone had died 10 minutes ago, the screen going black mid-call with social services. The sun was setting behind the skyscrapers, casting long shadows that made the street feel colder. "My roses will drown," Eleanor murmured, staring at the rushing water in the gutter. "Thomas always said I watered them too much." Jamal shifted his weight, trying to keep his arms steady as he held his backpack over their heads. "Tell me about your roses, Eleanor. What colors were they? Red ones? Yellow ones?" Her voice strengthened slightly. "I had a white one that Thomas gave me for my 60th birthday. Or was it my 70th? She clutched Jamal's blazer tighter around her shoulders. "What year is it?" "It's 2024, Jamal said gently. Eleanor's eyes widened. "That can't be right. Thomas is only 12. He has a baseball game this weekend." A group of men walked past, their shoes splashing through puddles. One of them slowed, looking Eleanor up and down. "Hey, kid," he called to Jamal. "That your grandma?" "We're fine," Jamal said firmly, the way his mother taught him to respond to strangers. "Just waiting for someone?" The man lingered. "You sure? Looks like she could use some help." Something in his tone made Jamal's skin crawl. "I said we're fine." Jamal straightened his back, trying to look bigger than his 13 years. The man shrugged and rejoined his friends, but Jamal noticed them stop at the corner, occasionally glancing back. "Are you cold?" Eleanor asked suddenly, trying to remove the blazer. "You shouldn't be cold. Boys need to stay warm, or they'll catch their death. That's what I always told Thomas." "Keep it on," Jamal insisted. "I'm okay." But he wasn't okay. His teeth were chattering, and his arm ached from holding up the backpack. The pharmacy bag with his father's medicine was soaked through, and he prayed the pills inside were still safe in their bottles. A police car cruised past, and Jamal's heart jumped. Maybe they could help. But then he remembered last summer, when the cops had been called on him and his friends for playing basketball in the park after dark. The car continued down the street without slowing. "I should call Thomas," Eleanor said, patting her pockets with trembling hands. "He'll be worried if I'm not home for dinner. I always make his favorite on Thursdays, meatloaf with extra ketchup." "What's Thomas's phone number?" Jamal asked, hoping to get some useful information. "Maybe we can find him." Eleanor's face crumpled. I don't. There was a card in my purse, but I lost my purse. Or did someone take it?" Her breathing quickened. "Someone took my purse. They took it." It's okay," Jamal soothed, recognizing the start of panic. He'd seen it in his father during bad nights. "We'll figure it out. Just breathe with me, okay?" More people hurried past, heads down against the rain. A few glanced their way, but no one stopped. The men on the corner were still watching, now joined by two others. The streetlights flickered on, casting harsh shadows. "I want to go home," Eleanor whispered, her voice small and frightened. "Please, I want to go home." "Help is coming," Jamal promised, though he wasn't sure anymore. His last call to social services had cut off before they could get an estimated arrival time. Without his phone, he couldn't call back. A crack of thunder made Eleanor jump. She grabbed Jamal's arm, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. "Margaret? Is that you, Margaret?" "No, it's Jamal. Remember? I'm staying with you until help comes." "Jamal," she repeated, then her eyes cleared slightly. "Yes, you stopped. Everyone else walked by, but you stopped." The men on the corner were moving closer now, speaking in low voices. Jamal's heart pounded. He looked up and down the street, hoping to see a police car, an ambulance, anyone official. But there was only the endless stream of indifferent faces hurrying past. "Hey, kid," one of the men called out. "It's getting late. Why don't you let us help the lady? We know a place she can stay." Eleanor's grip on Jamal's arm tightened. Even in her confusion, she seemed to sense the threat in their voices. "No, thank you," Jamal called back, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're waiting for social services." The men laughed. "Social services? Kid, they ain't coming out in this weather. Come on, be smart about this." Jamal's mind raced. The pharmacy down the street was closed. The bank building behind them was empty. The only open business he could see was a convenience store across the intersection, but getting there would mean walking past the men. Another crack of thunder, closer this time. Eleanor whimpered. "Thomas? Thomas, is that you?" "Sure, it's okay," Jamal whispered, though nothing felt okay. The men were barely 20 feet away now. His arms shook from cold and fatigue, but he couldn't put down the backpack. It was their only shelter from the rain. Then he heard it singing. Eleanor had started singing softly, her voice trembling but clear. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." The simple melody hit Jamal like a punch to the chest. His grandfather used to sing that same song, on good days when the pain wasn't too bad. "You make me happy when skies are gray." One of the men took another step forward. Jamal could smell alcohol on the rain-heavy air. "Last chance, kid. It's not safe out here at night. Let us help the lady." Jamal looked at Eleanor, still singing softly, clutching his blazer like a shield. He thought of his father waiting at home, in pain but safe. He thought of his mother, probably sick with worry by now. He thought of his grandfather, who had taught him that being a man meant doing what was right, especially when it was hard. "No," he said, surprised by the strength in his voice. "We're staying right here." The lead man's face hardened. He took another step forward, reaching out toward Eleanor. And that's when the police sirens split the night. Blue and red lights painted the rain in alternating colors. The police cruiser hadn't stopped. It was just passing through the intersection with its siren blaring at something else. But it was enough. The men backed away, melting into the shadows between buildings as quickly as they had appeared. Jamal's legs felt weak with relief. Eleanor was still singing, her voice barely a whisper now. "You'll never know, dear, how much I love you." "That's beautiful, Eleanor," he said, trying to keep his own voice from shaking. "Did you sing that to Thomas?" Every night before bed. She blinked, looking around as if seeing the street for the first time. Where, where is Thomas? Before Jamal could answer, a gruff voice called out from behind them. Hey, you too. Jamal spun around, automatically stepping in front of Eleanor. A heavy-set man stood in the doorway of the convenience store across the street, waving at them. Get in here before you catch your death. Jamal hesitated. The store's lights looked warm and inviting compared to the dark street, but Eleanor was already confused enough. Moving her might make things worse. It's okay, the man called again. I've been watching you with my security camera. Saw those guys giving you trouble. Come on, it's dry in here. Eleanor? Jamal touched her arm gently. Would you like to go inside where it's warm? She clutched his blazer tighter. I should wait for Thomas. He'll be home from school soon. Thomas would want you to be warm and dry, Jamal said, hoping he was doing the right thing. We can watch for him from inside. The mention of Thomas seemed to help. Eleanor nodded slowly, allowing Jamal to guide her across the street. The store owner held the door open, a blast of warm air hitting them as they entered. I'm Mr. Rodriguez, he said, flipping the open sign to closed. My wife's in the back. She's making some hot chocolate. The store was small but clean, with bright fluorescent lights and rows of neatly stocked shelves. A security monitor behind the counter showed different angles of the street outside. Jamal could see the corner where the men had been, empty now, but still threatening. Here, Mr. Rodriguez handed them each a paper towel. Dry off a bit. Maria, bring the hot chocolate. A short woman with kind eyes emerged from the back room, carrying 2 steaming cups. Dios mío, you're soaked through. Here sits it. She pulled 2 plastic chairs from behind the counter. Jamal helped Eleanor into one, making sure she was steady before taking the other. Thank you, he said, accepting the hot chocolate. His hands were shaking so badly, some of it sloshed over the rim. I saw what you did out there, Mr. Rodriguez said, leaning against the counter, standing up to those pendejos. That was brave. Stupid maybe, but brave. Language, Roberto, his wife scolded, wrapping a clean dish towel around Eleanor's shoulders. The boy did what was right. Eleanor stared into her hot chocolate, her expression distant. Thomas likes marshmallows in his. Little ones, not the big ones. Is Thomas your son? Mrs. Rodriguez asked gently. He's in Boston, Jamal explained. She gets confused sometimes. I've been trying to call social services, but my phone died. Mr. Rodriguez pulled a charging cord from under the counter. What kind of phone? iPhone. But I don't want to be any more trouble, Dash. No trouble. Mr. Rodriguez plugged in the cord. My daughter has the same one. Give it a few minutes to charge. Mrs. Rodriguez had gotten Eleanor talking about Thomas again, drawing out fragments of memory. His baseball trophies, his favorite blue sweater, the way he loved her meatloaf on Thursdays. And you, she turned to Jamal. What's your name? Brave one. Jamal Thompson, ma'am. Well, Jamal Thompson, your parents must be worried sick. The guilt hit him fresh. His father waiting for his medicine, his mother probably calling everyone they knew trying to find him. The pharmacy bag sat on the counter, the paper worn soft with rain. I need to call them, he said, as soon as my phone charges. My dad, he needs his medicine. Use the store phone. Mr. Rodriguez picked up the receiver. What's the number? Jamal recited his home number, his heart pounding. The phone rang twice before his mother's voice, tight with worry, answered. Hello, Mom? It's me, Jamal. Her voice cracked. Baby, where are you? We've been so worried. Your father, Dash, I know, Mom. I'm sorry. I'm okay. I'm at the convenience store on Michigan Avenue. There was this lady, Eleanor. She was lost and confused in the rain. I couldn't just leave her, Mom. I couldn't. There was a pause then. Is she okay? Yes, ma'am. The store owners are helping us. I tried calling social services, but my phone died. As soon as it charges, Dash, put the store owner on, please. Jamal handed the phone to Mr. Rodriguez, who walked a few steps away to talk to his mother. Eleanor had started humming again, the same Sunshine song, while Mrs. Rodriguez stroked her hand. Your mother is coming, Mr. Rodriguez said, returning the phone. She'll be here in 20 minutes. I gave her directions. Relief flooded through Jamal. Then he remembered his father's medicine. The pills, will they still be okay? They got a little wet. Mrs. Rodriguez examined the pharmacy bag. The bottles are sealed, Mijo. They're fine. Your father will be fine. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease. The security monitor showed empty streets, peaceful now that the storm was passing. But Jamal couldn't forget how quickly those men had appeared, how easily things could have gone wrong. Eleanor touched his arm, her pale eyes suddenly clear. "You stayed," she said, "like Thomas used to stay before he got too busy. Too important for his mama. I'm sure he misses you," Jamal said. "We'll find him." His phone had enough charge now to turn on. Immediately, notifications flooded the screen. Missed calls, texts, voicemails. But more importantly, the last number he dialed, social services. Mr. Rodriguez was already reaching for the store phone again. "Make the call, son. We'll keep her safe until they come." Jamal dialed, watching Eleanor in the bright store lights. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile, but also more peaceful. Mrs. Rodriguez had found a comb somewhere and was gently working it through Eleanor's wet hair while she hummed. "Social services? How may I help you?" "Hello? Yes, I called earlier about an elderly woman on Michigan Avenue. I'm with her now. We're at Rodriguez's convenience store." As he gave the details, Jamal thought about his grandfather's words. Sometimes God puts people in our path for a reason. Maybe tonight, he and Eleanor had been put in each other's paths. Both of them lost in their own ways. Both of them found by strangers' kindness. The bell above the store door chimed. Jamal turned, expecting his mother, but instead saw a uniformed social worker stepping out of the rain. "I'm looking for Eleanor," she said, showing her ID. "And the young man who's been helping her?" Eleanor looked up at the new voice, her humming stopping mid-note. Jamal stood, his legs still shaky. "That's us," he said. "I'm Jamal." The social worker introduced herself as Ms. Patterson, her rain boots squeaking against the store's linoleum floor. She carried a tablet in a waterproof case and wore an ID badge that caught the fluorescent light. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" she asked, pulling up a chair next to Eleanor. Jamal watched Eleanor's face, noting how she shrank away from the stranger. "Maybe I should explain," he said. "She gets nervous with new people." Ms. Patterson nodded, her fingers hovering over her tablet screen. "Go ahead. I found her outside the bank building. She was confused, couldn't remember where she lived. Just kept talking about her son Thomas in Boston and some roses." "Thomas?" Eleanor's head snapped up. "Is Thomas here?" "Not yet," Jamal said gently. "But we're going to try to find him." Ms. Patterson typed something on her tablet. "And you've been with her this whole time?" "Yes, ma'am. I couldn't leave her in the rain. There were some men." He glanced at the security monitor, but the street remained empty. "Men?" Ms. Patterson's voice sharpened. Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward. "I saw it all on my cameras. Some thugs were hanging around, giving them trouble. The boy stood his ground, protected her." Mrs. Rodriguez squeezed Jamal's shoulder. "Like a guardian angel. I have it on video if you need it," Mr. Rodriguez added. Ms. Patterson nodded. "That would be helpful." She turned to Eleanor, her voice softening. "Eleanor, can you tell me your last name?" Eleanor stared at her hands, still clutching Jamal's school blazer. "Worthington. Eleanor Grace Worthington." The clarity in her voice startled everyone. "Good. That's very good," Ms. Patterson typed quickly. "And Thomas. Is he your son?" "Thomas Andrew Worthington III. Eleanor's eyes focused suddenly, like a radio finding its signal. "He's the CEO of Maritime Technologies in Boston. He has an office overlooking the harbor. Floor 42. Then, just as quickly, the clarity faded. Or was that yesterday? But Ms. Patterson was already typing frantically. "Maritime Technologies? Yes, here it is. Thomas Worthington III. Her eyes widened slightly. "Oh, what is it?" Jamal asked. "There's been a missing persons report filed. 3 days ago, in Boston." She looked up from her tablet. "Eleanor Worthington, former professor of English literature at Boston University, reported missing from her assisted living facility." "Professor?" Jamal looked at Eleanor with new understanding. That explained her careful way of speaking, even when confused. The bell above the door chimed again. This time it was Jamal's mother who burst in, her nurse's scrubs visible under her rain jacket. "Jamal!" She wrapped him in a tight hug. then held him at arm's length to examine him. Baby, you're soaked through. What were you thinking? I'm sorry, Mom. I couldn't just walk past. Not after what Grandpa always said about helping people. His mother's face softened. She looked at Eleanor, who had started humming again, then back at Jamal. Your father was worried sick. The medicine, it's right here. Jamal grabbed the pharmacy bag from the counter. Mrs. Rodriguez checked. The pills are okay. Ms. Thompson? Ms. Patterson stood up. I'm from social services. Your son, what he did tonight? She seemed to be choosing her words carefully. Not many people would have stopped. Not many would have stayed. That's my boy, his mother said quietly. His grandfather raised him right. Eleanor's humming stopped abruptly. Professor Worthington, she said clearly. I'm Professor Worthington, and I'm late for my advanced poetry seminar. She tried to stand, but stumbled. Jamal caught her arm. It's okay, Professor. Class is canceled today because of the rain. She settled back in her chair, accepting this explanation. The students will be disappointed. We were covering Emily Dickinson. Miss Patterson's tablet chimed. I've made contact with Mr. Worthington's office in Boston. They're patching me through to him directly. She stepped away to take the call. Hope you're ready to be yelled at by some fancy CEO, Mr. Rodriguez said to Jamal. But Jamal wasn't listening. Eleanor had grabbed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. You stayed, she said again. In the rain. With the men. You stayed? Yes, ma'am. Why? Jamal thought about his grandfather in the hospital, about his father waiting at home in pain, about all the times he'd wish someone would stop and help instead of hurrying past. Because everyone deserves someone who stays. Miss Patterson returned, her face flushed with excitement. Mr. Worthington is on his way. He's taking his private jet. Should be here in a few hours. Eleanor? She knelt beside the elderly woman. Your son is coming? Thomas? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. My Thomas? Yes, and he's very grateful to you, Jamal. He wants to thank you personally. Jamal's mother squeezed his shoulder. We should get home to your father. He needs his medicine. But Jamal looked at Eleanor, still holding his hand. I'll stay with her, Mrs. Rodriguez said. We'll keep her safe and warm until her son arrives. Eleanor's grip tightened. Don't go, she whispered. Everyone goes. Jamal looked at his mother pleadingly. She checked her watch, then sighed. Let me take the medicine to your father. I'll explain everything. Then I'll come back for you. Really? Really? She kissed his forehead. Your grandfather would be proud, baby. So proud. After his mother left, Mr. Rodriguez brought more hot chocolate. Miss Patterson continued typing on her tablet, occasionally asking Eleanor gentle questions. Most of her answers were confused, but every now and then, a clear memory would surface. Teaching poetry at the university, raising Thomas alone after her husband died, the roses she'd grown in her garden. Blue ribbons, she said suddenly. My roses won blue ribbons at the garden show. Thomas was so proud. He was 12, wearing his baseball uniform because he had a game that afternoon. The baseball game you mentioned earlier, Jamal said. Was that the same day? Eleanor nodded, then frowned. Or was it? The years, they get mixed up. Like watercolors in the rain. She touched the wet sleeve of Jamal's blazer. You're still here? I'm still here. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The security monitors showed puddles reflecting the streetlights, peaceful now that the storm had passed. Somewhere in the sky above them, a private jet was racing through the night, carrying his son back to his mother. Mrs. Rodriguez brought blankets from the back room, wrapping one around Eleanor's shoulders to replace the damp blazer. Look at her eyes, she whispered to Jamal. They're clearer now. Sometimes people just need to feel safe before they can find themselves again. Eleanor had started reciting something under her breath. Jamal leaned closer to hear. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Emily Dickinson, Miss Patterson said softly. Her favorite poet, according to her file, and sweetest in the gale is heard. Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger. And sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird. Jamal found himself joining in, remembering the poem from English class. That kept so many warm. Eleanor's eyes met his, completely clear for a moment. You know poetry? Yes, ma'am. We studied that one in school. Good. Poetry is important. It helps us remember who we are, even when we forget everything else. She squeezed his hand. I may not remember much tomorrow, but I'll remember you stayed. When the storm was sorest, you stayed. Jamal's mother returned to the convenience store just before midnight. By then, Eleanor had dozed off in her chair, wrapped in Mrs. Rodriguez's blanket, while Miss Patterson continued making calls and arrangements. The store's fluorescent lights cast long shadows across the empty aisles. "Time to go home, baby," his mother said softly. "Your father's asking for you." Jamal looked at Eleanor's sleeping face, peaceful now, the worried lines smoothed away. "Will she be okay?" "Miss Patterson says her son's plane lands in an hour. She's in good hands." Mrs. Rodriguez touched his shoulder. "Go on, Mijo. You've done enough for one night." The drive home was quiet. Streetlights flashed across the dashboard as they passed through familiar neighborhoods. His mother's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. "Your father was in a lot of pain," she finally said. "Waiting for his medicine." The guilt hit Jamal like a physical blow. "I'm sorry. I know you are," she sighed. "But sometimes being sorry isn't enough. Actions have consequences, Jamal." They pulled up to their small house. The porch light was on, and through the living room window, Jamal could see the blue glow of the TV. His father would be in his recliner, probably pretending to watch late-night shows while fighting the pain. His mother turned off the engine, but didn't move to get out. "What you did tonight, helping that woman, was good. Your grandfather would have done the same thing." She turned to look at him. "But you also made choices that hurt people who depend on you." "I didn't mean to." "I know, baby. That's what makes it complicated." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "Life isn't always about choosing between right and wrong. Sometimes it's about choosing between two rights or two wrongs, or something in between." They walked up to the house together. The front door creaked. It always did, no matter how many times they oiled the hinges. The TV volume was low, just a murmur in the darkness. "Dad?" Jamal called out softly. "In here, son." His father's voice was strained, but not angry. Jamal followed the sound to the living room, where the recliner was pushed back as far as it would go. The lamp cast just enough light to see his father's face, drawn with pain but trying to smile. "I heard you had quite an adventure tonight." Jamal's eyes burned. "I'm so sorry, Dad." "The medicine dash, come here." His father patted the arm of the recliner. Jamal perched there carefully, trying not to jostle him. "Your mother told me what happened. About the elderly woman in the rain. I should have brought your medicine first. I should have dash, stop." His father's hand found his, squeezed weakly. "You know what the worst part of being sick is? It's not the pain. It's not even the fear. It's feeling useless. Watching your wife work 2 jobs. Watching your son take on responsibilities no 13-year-old should have to carry." In the kitchen, they could hear his mother moving around, opening cabinets, probably making tea like she always did when she was worried. "Tonight," his father continued, "when you didn't come home, when we couldn't reach you, I was scared. But then your mother called, told me where you were, what you were doing." He paused, fighting back a wave of pain. "And you know what I felt? Pride. So much pride it almost hurt worse than the cancer. But you were in pain, waiting dash, yes. And that matters. But you know what else matters? That my son sees people who need help and doesn't walk past. That he stands up to bad men to protect a confused old woman. That he has his grandfather's heart." Jamal's mother appeared with 3 mugs of tea on a tray. She set it on the coffee table, then settled on the couch nearby. "I got some text from Miss Patterson while driving home," she said. "Eleanor's son? He's some big-shot CEO. Founded his own company, worth millions. Guess he did okay without those baseball trophies," Jamal said, remembering Eleanor's fragments of memory. His father shifted in the recliner, wincing. "Baseball trophies?" She kept talking about when he was 12, had a baseball game the day her roses won blue ribbons. Jamal sipped his tea, the warmth spreading through his still damp clothes. She remembered that really clearly, even when she couldn't remember what year it was. "Memory's funny that way," his father said. "The big things slip away, but the small moments, a baseball game, a blue ribbon, a boy with an umbrella in the rain, those stick." His mother's phone buzzed. She checked it, her eyes widening. "Miss Patterson again. Eleanor's son just landed. He's on his way to the store." She looked at Jamal. He wants to meet you tomorrow. Me? Why? Why do you think, baby? You saved his mother. Stood guard over her for hours in the rain. Protected her when those men... She stopped, her voice catching. I didn't do it for any reward. No, his father said. You did it because it was right. Because that's who you are. Another wave of pain crossed his face, and he couldn't quite hide the grimace. Jamal jumped up. Your pills. Do you need another dose? Not for another hour. His father caught his hand. Sit with me a while. Tell me about her. About Eleanor. So Jamal sat on the arm of the recliner and told them everything. About Eleanor's confused eyes and elegant speech. About Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez's kindness. About the Emily Dickinson poem and the way Eleanor had gripped his hand and said, you stayed, like it was the most important thing in the world. His mother made more tea. His father dozed off between stories, exhausted by the pain, but smiling slightly. Outside, the last puddles from the storm were evaporating in the warm night air. Jamal's phone buzzed, a text from Mrs. Rodriguez. She's awake. Keeps asking for you. But don't worry, her son just arrived. You should see how she lit up when she saw him. Like Christmas morning. Attached was a photo. Eleanor, still wrapped in the blanket, reaching up to touch the face of a tall man in an expensive suit who was kneeling beside her chair. Even through the grainy security camera image, you could see the tears on both their faces. You did good, Mijo, Mrs. Rodriguez's next text read. Sleep well. Jamal showed the photo to his mother, who had tears in her eyes too. What happens now? He asked. Now. She kissed his forehead. Now you go to bed. Tomorrow's another day, and something tells me it's going to be an interesting one. As Jamal headed to his room, his father's voice stopped him. Son? Yes, sir? Your grandfather. He would have been so proud. Not just of what you did, but of who you are. Jamal thought about Eleanor's words. Poetry helps us remember who we are, even when we forget everything else. I hope so, he said. I really hope so. The next morning, Jamal woke to the sound of car doors closing outside. Through his bedroom window, he saw a black Lincoln Navigator parked in front of their house, its polished surface gleaming in the early sunlight. A man in a suit stood by the driver's door, talking on a phone. The clock on his nightstand read 7:15 a.m. Usually, he'd be rushing to get ready for school, but his mother had called the principal last night to explain the situation. His bedroom door creaked open. Jamal? His mother's voice was tight with tension. Baby, you need to get up. We have visitors. Jamal pulled on clean jeans and his least-worn t-shirt, trying to smooth down his hair as he followed his mother to the living room. His father was already there, sitting straighter in his recliner than Jamal had seen in weeks. In the middle of their small living room stood Thomas Worthington III. He looked exactly like the kind of person who would have an office on the 42nd floor overlooking Boston Harbor, tall, well-dressed, with silver hair and an expensive watch. But his eyes were red-rimmed, like he'd been crying. Jamal! Thomas stepped forward, hand extended. I've been waiting to meet you. Jamal shook his hand, noticing how firm the grip was. How's Eleanor, your mother? Resting comfortably at the Peninsula Hotel. The best suite they had available. Thomas's voice caught slightly. She asked about you this morning. Wanted to know if the boy with the umbrella was okay. It was just my backpack, actually, Jamal mumbled. Just your backpack? Thomas shook his head. Just your backpack, just 4 hours in the rain, just standing up to those men. He turned to Jamal's parents. Do you know what the police found when they reviewed the security footage from the bank? Those men who were watching them? They had records. Long ones. Jamal's mother made a small sound in her throat. But that's not why I'm here. Thomas reached into his suit jacket and pulled out an envelope. Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Thompson, I understand you've been having some difficulties with medical expenses. Jamal's father straightened further in his recliner. We manage. Dad, Jamal started to say, but Thomas held up a hand. Please let me finish. What your son did last night. He paused, collecting himself. My mother has been missing for 3 days. She wandered away from her assisted living facility during a staff change. We had police searching 3 states, private investigators, and all that time, she was right here in Chicago, confused and alone, until your son found her. He handed the envelope to Jamal's mother. Her hands shook as she opened it. That's not. Her eyes widened as she read the check inside. We can't accept this. You can and you will. Thomas's voice was firm. It's enough to cover all current medical expenses and ensure the best possible care moving forward. I've also arranged for a specialist from Mayo Clinic to review Mr. Thompson's case. He'll be here next week. Jamal's father tried to protest, but Thomas continued, please. My mother, she raised me alone after my father died. Worked 2 jobs to put me through college. Everything I am, everything I've built, I owe to her. And last night, when everyone else walked past, your son stopped. He protected her, kept her safe. Tears were flowing freely down his mother's face now. She clutched the check like it might disappear. There's more, Thomas said. Jamal, my mother mentioned you're trying for a scholarship? Yes, sir, for high school next year. The private academy downtown has a program. Phillips Academy. Thomas nodded. I'm on the board of trustees. Your application has been fast-tracked. Full scholarship, including books, uniforms, and transportation. The room spun slightly. Phillips Academy was the best school in Chicago. The kind of school that sent students to Harvard and Yale. But Jamal looked at his parents. The entrance exam isn't for months. You earned this, Thomas said firmly. Not just with your grades, which I've already reviewed, but with your character. The kind of person who stands in the rain for hours to protect a confused old woman. That's exactly the kind of person Phillips Academy needs. A knock at the door made them all jump. The driver entered, phone still in hand. Mr. Worthington, your mother's awake. She's asking for Jamal again. Thomas checked his watch. The hotel's about 20 minutes from here. Would you like to see her? All of you? Jamal looked at his father, worried about moving him. But there was a new energy in his father's face. I'd like that, his father said. I'd like to meet the woman my son helped. The driver brought a wheelchair from the car. Jamal and his mother helped his father into it while Thomas made some calls. The morning sun was fully up now, making the navigator's black paint gleam like water. I don't understand, Jamal's mother whispered as they walked to the car. All this just because he helped someone? Not just someone, Thomas said, overhearing. My mother, the woman who gave up everything to give me a chance. And now, he looked at Jamal. Now I could do the same for your family. The driver helped get Jamal's father comfortable in the car's spacious back seat. As they pulled away from the curb, Jamal saw Mrs. Chun from the pharmacy watching from her front porch across the street. She waved, smiling. Your mother's been telling stories about you all morning, Thomas said as they drove. Well, the part she remembers. She keeps talking about how you knew Emily Dickinson. Just one poem, Jamal said. From school, hope is the thing with feathers, his father quoted softly from the back seat. That perches in the soul, Jamal continued, and sings the tune without the words. Thomas joined in, and never stops at all. They finished the poem together as the navigator wound its way downtown, past the bank building where it all started, past Rodriguez's convenience store where Mr. Rodriguez was setting up his morning display. I've arranged for Eleanor to move to a better facility, Thomas said. One closer to my office in Boston. But she insisted on staying in Chicago an extra day to see you again. Will she remember me? Jamal asked. Thomas's eyes met his in the rearview mirror. She might not remember all the details, but she remembers how you made her feel. Safe. Protected. Seen? He cleared his throat. Sometimes that's more important than remembering the facts. The Peninsula Hotel rose before them, its golden doors gleaming in the morning sun. As the driver helped Jamal's father back into the wheelchair, a doorman in a crisp uniform held the door open and nodded respectfully. Ready? Thomas asked. Jamal thought about Eleanor's words from the night before. Poetry helps us remember who we are, even when we forget everything else. Ready, he said, and stepped into the lobby's warm light. The Peninsula Hotel's penthouse suite was bigger than Jamal's entire house. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a room filled with elegant furniture and fresh flowers. Eleanor sat in a plush armchair by the window, wearing a new blue dress, her white hair neatly combed. She was staring out at the city skyline when they entered. Mom? Thomas called softly. Look who's here to see you. Eleanor turned. For a moment, her eyes were distant, confused. Then they landed on Jamal, and her face lit up. The boy with the umbrella. You came back. Hello, Professor Worthington, Jamal said, using her formal title like she had the night before. Professor. She smiled, touching her hair. Yes, I was a professor, wasn't I? Poetry and literature at Boston University. She gestured to the chairs around her. Please sit. All of you. Jamal's father wheeled himself next to Eleanor while his mother took the sofa nearby. Thomas remained standing, watching the scene with bright eyes. You must be Jamal's parents, Eleanor said, her voice stronger than it had been in the rain. You should be very proud. He has a poet's soul. We are proud, Jamal's father said, though I'm not sure about the poet part. Baseball's more his thing. Eleanor's eyes lit up. Baseball. Thomas played baseball. Won trophies. The day my roses won blue ribbons. She trailed off, looking confused. It's okay, Mom, Thomas said gently. That was a good day. A hotel staff member wheeled in a cart loaded with breakfast, eggs, bacon, fresh fruit, pastries still warm from the oven. The smell made Jamal's stomach growl. He realized he hadn't eaten since yesterday's lunch at school. Please help yourselves, Thomas insisted. Jamal, there's hot chocolate. Mom says you like it. As they ate, Eleanor drifted in and out of clarity. Sometimes she was the sharp-minded professor, quoting poetry and asking Jamal about his studies. Other times she'd look around in confusion, asking when they were going home to water her roses. The new facility in Boston has a garden, Thomas told them. They're going to let her grow roses there. Blue ribbon roses, Eleanor murmured. Then she focused suddenly on Jamal's father. You're sick. Like my Henry was. The room went quiet. Thomas straightened. Mom, you haven't mentioned Dad in years. The pain, Eleanor continued, looking at Jamal's father. It shows in your eyes, like it did in Henry's. But you're getting help now. Yes, ma'am, Jamal's father replied. Thanks to your son, Thomas takes care of things. Eleanor patted Thomas's hand. Even when he's too busy to visit. Thomas flinched. Mom, I dash you. She squeezed his hand. I remember enough to know you're busy. Important man now. But you came when it mattered. She turned back to Jamal. Like you came when it mattered. A nurse appeared at the door. Time for your medication, Mrs. Worthington. Already? Eleanor sighed. The days get so mixed up now. But last night is clear. The rain, the fear, and then she reached for Jamal's hand. You stayed? After Eleanor took her medicine, she began to doze in her chair. The nurse adjusted her blanket while Thomas led them to the suite's living room. The Mayo Clinic specialist will be here Monday, he told Jamal's parents. I've arranged for a car service to take you to all appointments. He handed them a business card. My private number is on there. Any problems, any at all, you call me directly. Jamal's mother wiped her eyes. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me. Thank your son. Thomas turned to Jamal. The scholarship paperwork will be ready next week. The school's excited to have you. Will Jamal hesitated. Will I still have time to help Dad? With the new school and everything, that's all arranged too. The car service will handle getting your father to appointments. Your mother's schedule at the hospital has been adjusted, full pay, fewer hours. He smiled at their shocked expressions. I have some influence with the hospital board. Why? Jamal asked. Why do all this? Thomas was quiet for a moment. When I was 12, the day Mom's roses won those blue ribbons, I had a baseball game. She'd been up since dawn tending her garden, but she still came to my game. Sat in the bleachers for hours, even though it was hot and she was tired. I hit my first home run that day. He walked to the window, looking out at the city. I got busy after that, building my company, making my fortune. The visits home got shorter, less frequent. Then the confusion started, and his voice caught. I told myself she was fine. The facility was expensive, the best in Boston. But I didn't visit. Not enough. He turned back to them. Then she wandered away, and for 3 days, I imagined every horrible thing that could have happened. But instead, she found your son. Or he found her. And he did what I should have done all along. He stayed. A soft voice came from the bedroom doorway. Poetry helps us remember. They turned. Eleanor stood there, leaning on her nurse's arm, fully awake again. Mom, you should be resting. I've rested enough. She walked carefully to Jamal. I remember now. You quoted Dickinson with me. About hope being the thing with feathers. Yes, ma'am. Do you know why I love that poem? She didn't wait for an answer. Because hope isn't some grand thing. It's small like a bird, like a boy with a backpack in the rain, like roses winning blue ribbons on the same day as a baseball game. She touched Jamal's cheek. The smallest acts of kindness can change everything. Thomas cleared his throat. The car's waiting downstairs. Dad has his appointment this afternoon. Will we see you again? Jamal asked Eleanor. I'm here until tomorrow. Thomas arranged it. She smiled at her son. He takes care of things now. In the elevator going down, Jamal's mother squeezed his hand. Your grandfather would have loved this. The hotel? The scholarship? No, baby. The way you made that woman feel safe. The way you stayed when it was hard. The car was waiting outside, sleek and black in the morning sun. As the driver helped his father in, Jamal looked up at the penthouse windows. Eleanor stood there, watching them leave, Thomas beside her. They both waved. Ready for your appointment, Mr. Thompson? The driver asked. Jamal's father smiled. A real smile, without pain hiding behind it. Ready as I'll ever be. As they pulled away from the hotel, Jamal saw Rodriguez's convenience store in the distance. Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez were outside, arranging their display. They waved as the car passed. Hope is the thing with feathers, Jamal whispered to himself, watching the city scroll by. Yesterday, he'd walked these same streets in the rain, carrying his father's medicine, worried about bills and scholarships and all the weight on his young shoulders. Today, the sun was shining, and hope wasn't just perching in his soul, it was soaring. 1 month later, Jamal walked through the doors of the Thompson Center for Elder Care, his new Phillips Academy blazer crisp against his shoulders. The center, funded by Thomas Worthington III, had opened last week in the renovated building that used to be an abandoned community center. The lobby smelled of fresh paint and coffee. Good morning, Jamal, Ms. Patterson called from the front desk. She'd left social services to run the center's outreach program. They're waiting for you in the garden. The back of the building had been transformed into a small but beautiful garden. Raised beds made it easy for residents to tend plants from their wheelchairs. And in the center, just beginning to bloom, were rows of roses. Mr. Rodriguez was there, helping an elderly man with a watering can. After that night in the rain, he'd volunteered to teach gardening twice a week. His convenience store now had a hot meal program for seniors, funded by the Worthington Foundation. There he is! Mrs. Rodriguez appeared from behind a trellis, carrying plant markers. Come see the roses, Mijo. They're about to bloom. Jamal checked his watch. He had an hour before he needed to catch the car to his father's appointment at Mayo Clinic. The treatments were working. The pain was less frequent now, and color had returned to his father's face. His phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. Mom's roses won another blue ribbon yesterday. She asked if you were taking care of her garden in Chicago. Eleanor had moved to the new facility in Boston, close enough for daily visits from Thomas. She still had confused days, but the staff said she was happier, especially in the garden. She sent Jamal pressed rose petals in every letter, along with quotes from Emily Dickinson. Jamal! A familiar voice called from the garden entrance. His mother stood there in her new nurse's uniform. She'd taken a position at the center, working regular hours instead of exhausting double shifts. Everything okay? He asked. Perfect. Just wanted to remind you. Dad's appointment is at 2. The car will pick you up here. The car service had become part of their routine now. His father joked that he felt like a CEO himself, being driven to his appointments in a luxury vehicle. But they all knew what it really meant. No more missed medications. No more choosing between bills and treatment. Look who's here. Mrs. Rodriguez pointed to the garden gate. Jamal turned to see his father walking. Actually walking with just a cane for support through the entrance. The latest round of treatments had worked better than anyone hoped. Thought I'd come early, his father said, making his way to a bench. Watch you work your magic with these roses. The roses had been Jamal's idea. After Eleanor left, he'd asked Thomas about starting a garden at the new center. Something to remind people that beauty grows even in the city, he'd said. Thomas had done more than approve the garden. He'd sent Eleanor's own rose cultivation notes, carefully copied during her lucid moments. You know what today is? his father asked as Jamal checked the soil moisture in one of the beds. 1 month since the rain. 1 month since you chose to stop instead of walk past. A group of residents emerged from the building for their morning garden time. Among them was a woman who reminded Jamal of Eleanor. She had the same elegant way of speaking, the same love of poetry. She'd been living in her car until the center opened. "Young man," she called out, wheeling herself to the rose beds. "Would you read to us again? The poem about hope?" Jamal smiled. This had become part of the routine too. Poetry readings in the garden, suggested by Eleanor in one of her letters. She may not remember everything Thomas had written, but she remembers poetry helps. "Hope is the thing with feathers," Jamal began, and several residents joined in, their voices mixing with the morning air. His phone buzzed again, a photo from Thomas. Eleanor in her Boston garden, holding a blue ribbon, smiling at the camera. The caption read, "She remembered you this morning. Asked if the boy with the umbrella was still helping people." Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with cups of hot chocolate for everyone, another tradition that had carried over from that rainy night. Her husband had closed the store this morning to help with a new delivery of garden supplies. "You know what your grandfather would say about all this?" his father asked, sipping his hot chocolate. "That being a man means doing what needs doing." That too. But mostly he'd say this is what legacy looks like. Not money or buildings, but moments. Choices. The decision to stop when others walk past. A car horn honked outside. Probably Mr. Washington from the corner store, delivering day-old bread for the center's breakfast program. The whole neighborhood had changed since the center opened. People stopped to help each other more, looked out for each other. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. Jamal quoted Eleanor's words from the hotel. His mother joined him on the bench, her nurse's shoes already showing the signs of a busy morning. "Speaking of kindness, did you show them the letter?" Jamal pulled the envelope from his blazer pocket. Phillips Academy's logo was crisp in the corner. Inside was his first report card, all A's. "Eleanor would be proud," his father said. "The professor and her especially." "She is proud," Jamal smiled. "She wrote me last week in one of her clear moments. Said she's following my progress from Boston. The roses were starting to open, their petals catching the morning sun. Soon they'd be ready for the city garden show." Jamal had already promised to send Eleanor photos, and Thomas had arranged for her to attend via video call during one of her good days. His phone buzzed one last time, a message from the car service reminding him about his father's appointment. But there was no anxiety now, no worry about bills or missed medications or long nights alone. Just gratitude and a deeper understanding of what his grandfather had meant about strength. "Time for your treatment, Dad." His father stood carefully, stronger than he'd been in months. "You know, son, I used to worry about leaving you and your mother alone. Not anymore. Because of the foundation? The treatments? Because my son knows what matters. Knows when to stop in the rain." They walked together to the waiting car, past the blooming roses and the gathered residents still reciting poetry. Mrs. Rodriguez called out a reminder about tomorrow's gardening lesson. Ms. Patterson waved from her office where she was organizing the center's new outreach program. As the car pulled away, Jamal saw his reflection in the window, the Phillips Academy blazer, so different from his old school uniform, but his grandfather's eyes looking back at him. He thought about Eleanor, tending her roses in Boston, about Thomas, making time now for daily visits, about hope being the thing with feathers, perching in the soul. 1 month ago, he'd stood in the rain and made a choice. Now that choice had bloomed into something larger than himself. A garden, a center, a community coming together. But mostly, it had bloomed into a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. The car turned onto Michigan Avenue, passing the spot where he'd first seen Eleanor. Someone had planted flowers there, bright blooms pushing up through the city concrete. Life finding a way, just like hope finding a perch. "Ready for your appointment, Mr. Thompson?" the driver asked. His father smiled. "Ready as always. My son's with me," and that, Jamal knew, made all the difference in the world.